welcome this morning to our second of 4 gender and sexuality adult education classes. A reminder, our goal is to educate ourselves about gender and sexuality, dispel myths and misconceptions, and become better allies with our LGBTQ plus friends and family. This class will help us to become more gender inclusive followers of Christ. In today's session, we'll review the agreements from last time. Levon will offer a prayer, and we'll get right into Joe's presentation. Joe will follow with a Q&A, and then we'll close with a preview for next week's class. So just as a reminder, some expectations and housekeeping around this class. Please feel free to ask questions, but approach with curiosity and an open mind and an open heart. Welcome discomfort. That's what happens when we learn and unlearn. Speak from your experience, tell your own story. Remember that you may not know everything about the other people in the room or their close friends and family. Like every other zone and place at Portland Mennonite, this is a non-judgment zone. Any of us who are presenting or supporting this class are available for further conversations offline. We are Levon Blowers, Lois Gearhart, Chris Bargu, Vange Gerber, and Sylvia Schurt. We also will be doing a survey at the end of this session for anyone who's participated. So we would like to perhaps do another class, and we'd like to hear what your thoughts are about this one and what you'd like to see going forward. We are recording this presentation only. Any conversations or questions or chats will be deleted, but we will include that in the PMC website. And I don't know if you had a chance to check it out, but last week's session was recorded and is on the website if you missed that and would like to review that again. So with that, we'll go to Levon for a prayer and then on to Joe.
Okay, let's pray. I pray for us as a faith community as we learn about LGBTQ plus issues.
Things too.
I pray that God will give us insight, wisdom, clear understanding, and guide us toward truth, justice, love, and light. Amen.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Joe Blowers. For those of you who don't know me, I'm not a medical doctor, but I did teach biology for 30 years to everything from 6th graders to 9th graders. So I've had a lot of experience in the area. And I don't know if you were able to watch last week's session or not, but I hope you came away with the idea that that gender is really not so much about biology. It's more about, well, it's a variety of things. It's more about societal expectations. It's about upbringing. It's about personal psychology. It's about a lot of things. It's not really about biology. Today, as a biologist, I'm going to focus on biology. And we aren't going to be talking about gender very much. We're really talking about sex, about biological sex. And so I'm going to start my presentation. There we go. Is everybody able to see that? All right. So biological sex is something that's measurable. It's something you can look at a person and measure their chemicals, and to some extent it's medically measurable, unlike gender. Now you'll find, as we're going to find out pretty quickly, that comes with a lot of caveats, and we'll talk about what those caveats are in a minute. Biological sex itself is a little bit of an old term now. It was once it's now referred to as sex assigned at birth, and that's a label given to you usually by a doctor based on hormones, chromosomes, and your genitals. Now, remember those three things, because the interplay of those three things are pretty important. Hormones, chromosomes, and genitals. And another word for chromosomes is DNA. Chromosomes are just one of the ways that your DNA is organized inside your cells. So that's pretty simple, right? I think you're going to find out that it's not. So here's a human fetus at 7 weeks old, which is an amazing photo, I think. You can already see an eye, fingers, toes, a nose, the beginning of an ear, the beginning of a spinal cord. Isn't that an amazing photo? There are two words I want you to remember about this fetus. And I want you to remember that 7-week-old age. That's an important age. So at this point, here are the two words. The fetus is bipotential. Bi means two, and there are more or less two potentials, two ways that this fetus could go in terms of sex. And the gonads, which gonads get used various ways, but the way I'm using gonads are your sex glands. So for a female, your sex glands are your ovaries. And for a male, your sex glands are your testes. And you may or may not know this, but whether you have testes or whether you have ovaries, they all start when you're a fetus. They all start up in your back, up in your near your kidneys, really. And at this point, at 7 weeks, they're undifferentiated, meaning they're not testes, they're not ovaries, they're just barely something that could become either testes or ovaries. Those two words are important, so remember those. So what drives prenatal sexual development? The sexual development of a baby, or what will become a baby. So one of the things is, this is for most fetuses, it's not always true, as we're going to find out, but most fetuses have their DNA during cell division is organized into chromosomes. And a couple of the chromosomes are, when you look at them under a microscope, they're actually shaped like X's, or like an X and a Y. And so I think we've all learned this. Females typically have an X and an X, and males have a chromosomes that are shaped like an X and a Y. And that difference of whether there's a second X or whether there's a Y makes a huge difference. So remember that the 7-week-old fetus was bipotential, could go either way. Well, what's going to make the difference at first is whether that fetus has an X as a second chromosome or a Y as a second chromosome. So if it has a Y, then those gonads, those two little sex glands that are up in the back, are going to develop into testes typically. And if it doesn't have the Y chromosome, then those two little gonads are going to develop into ovaries. So it's the presence or absence of that Y chromosome that makes all the difference to some extent. And we're going to find out, again, there's a lot of caveats to that. So once the gonads develop into testes, they would start producing more testosterone, and presumably the development of that fetus would become male. Or if that Y is absent, then the gonads are going to develop into ovaries. The ovaries are going to produce more estrogen and other female hormones, and presumably that fetus is going to develop into a female. Now, a couple of things you need to know. We all, whether we're male or female, we all have estrogen, which is a female hormone, and we all have testosterone, which is male hormone. So it isn't presence or absence, it's really how much. So a typical male has a lot of testosterone and a fairly small amount of estrogen. A typical female has a lot of estrogen and a fairly small amount of testosterone, but we have both, and that's important to remember also. And and it changes with age, as many of us know. The older we get, typically the less estrogen females have and the less testosterone males have. Moving on to the next slide. Remember that 7 weeks again. So I want to take just a little detour and talk about the brain, because that's the thing I've often been curious about is there a difference in the brain between males and females? And, what does this sexual differentiation that happens in a fetus have to do with the brain? Well, the short answer is we don't know. There's a whole lot that we do not understand about the brain, and particularly about how the brain is affected by sexual development. We probably know I would say that the amount of information we don't know is much larger than the amount that we know about the brain development. But suffice it to say that there is a difference between male and female brains typically, and it is probably affected by genetics and hormones. But that's about it for as far as what we know. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the brain today, simply because there's just so little that we know about how sexual development affects the brain. By the way, I'm going to let me just say I'm going to be introducing a lot of ideas and a lot of words, and I'm trying to actually keep the number of new words down to a manageable level, but this can be a bit overwhelming. So anytime that you have a question or you feel like I'm not being clear, feel free to unmute yourself and just identify yourself and then ask a question, because I don't want to barge ahead and have you confused about something that I'm saying or trying to say. So this page is going to get more and more complicated as I keep adding weeks to this. Just keep in mind that as I keep adding more things, these things that are on the list right now, week 4, week 5, and week 6, those will remain at the top of the list. And then I'll keep adding things to the bottom. So if you get lost, just look up at week 4 and 5 and 6 and realize I'm just adding more things. The reason I have 2 hands on here pointing in different directions isn't because it's that simple. It isn't just as simple as a male, you either get a male baby or you get a female baby when they're born. It's not that simple, but it does kind of progress in 2 directions, as we talked about. If there's a Y chromosome and if the testes start producing testosterone, then typically development progresses so that we end up with a baby that's a recognizable male. Or if that Y chromosome is missing and the gonads develop into ovaries, then we end up with a baby that is recognizable as a female. That's the way it usually happens. But I don't mean to say here that there's only 2 choices by putting those 2 pointing hands on the screen. So week 4, if you know anything about sexual anatomy of males and females, there's a lot of tubes involved. For instance, males have tubes that run from their testes and then up through their back, kind of looping around their bladder, and then joining up with some other tubes that are coming from the kidneys, and then out through a tube going through the center of the penis. So there's a lot of tubes involved. Females also have tubes, fallopian tubes leading down to the uterus. The uterus itself is kind of a big tube, and then of course the vagina is a tube. But they're using, on this screen, they're using the word ducts. And in this case, they use the word precursor ducts. And what that means is that, that before it's recognizable as something male, there is something that looks like a tube, and it's potential. It could become a male part. Now, the really interesting thing to me here is that it develops before the gonads even develop into testes. And so both males and females get it. So at one point, women who are listening to this, you had potentially male parts developing inside of you. And the opposite is true. We're going to find out in just a second. So week 5, these gonads develop, but they're not, remember, they're undifferentiated. They aren't male or female gonads yet. They just could go either way. Week 6, female parts start to develop, but not just in females. They develop in both males and females. So gentlemen listening to this, you at one point in your development had female, at least what could become female parts. That's important. So week 8, after that week 7 that I told you was so important, finally, if there's a Y chromosome present in the cells, then the testes start to develop out of those gonads and testosterone production begins. And that is the differentiator. That's the first thing that starts to tell the embryo, develop this way or develop the other way, whether that testosterone production happens or not during week 8. Now it gets more complicated. So as you can imagine, if that testosterone starts to be produced, those female parts that formed in the males, or the embryos with Y chromosomes, those female parts are going to start to basically be reabsorbed back into the other cells. That they're not going to go away. Their parts are just going to get reused for making other parts, but they're going to disappear. Week 9, if there's no Y chromosome, if there's 2 X's instead, females will begin to develop eggs in their ovaries. Now, they're not real eggs at this point. They're things that will become eggs. Finally, at week 10, 3 weeks after this, or 2 weeks after this beginning of production of testosterone, males begin to grow what looks like a penis. And when it starts, it really doesn't very much like a penis, but it's something on the outside that will become a penis. And in week 10, if the gonads are producing more estrogen than testosterone in females, then those male parts regress, they disappear. Week 12, this tube inside the penis is completed in males. So really only 4 weeks after testosterone production begins. Now remember this part, because there's a story I'm going to tell later about that urethra inside the penis that figures prominently in a story I'm going to tell a little bit later. Week 14, males begin to produce rudimentary sperm. How am I doing? Am I moving too quickly, or is this so far so good? Okay. Now it gets more complicated. So week 12, week 14, actually we talked about that. Week 24, finally the females, which for some reason female anatomy develops a little bit later in the fetus. The vagina becomes a canal in females, and the follicle cells, which we talked about before, things that could become eggs, are now fully formed in females. An interesting aside, which you might know, is that females, when they're born, are born with every single egg, every single follicle cell they will ever have, which could become eggs. We usually talk about them as eggs. They already have them. They don't develop anymore during their lives. And so a 40-year-old woman having a baby is using a 40-year-old follicle cell to try to fertilize that cell and have a baby. Males, on the other hand, they produce sperm up until the point where they can't anymore, sometime in old age. Week 28, testes descend into the scrotum in males. Remember, up until this point, where have those testes been? They've been up in the back, right near where a female's ovaries are. And sometimes they don't make it down into the scrotum by birth, but usually they make it down by week 28. Now, keep in mind that everything I'm talking about here is what usually happens. And that's important because on this next slide, I'm going to ask you, if you don't have a piece of paper, you might want to grab one, a piece of paper and a pencil, or you could do it on your phone, or you could just do it in your head. But I want you to think about all of these things that we've talked about so far, all the way from, now I added a week 0 up here, when the sex cells contribute, remember, the X or a Y chromosome. So you end up with typically an embryo that has 2 X's or an X and a Y. So think about all the way from week 0 to week 28. And think about the question I've written across the top of this slide. Now, I don't use the word normal here on purpose. And I don't use the word normal because normal is not what we're talking about here. There really is no normal. There's predominant. So you end up typically with most children when they're born end up as a recognizable male or recognizable female. That's predominant, but it's not necessarily normal, because there's all kinds of things that could happen and they're all normal. So which things might not happen quite as expected? Look at this list and think of some ways that we could be surprised in the way development happens. Got cats walking around me. I'll give you another 30 seconds. Maybe just jot down a few ideas of things that could happen and surprise us, not necessarily going according to script. Okay, I'm going to turn this off and quit sharing. So I would just like to hear, feel free to unmute yourself and make sure you identify who you are, but I just like to hear, what are some things you came up with? What are some things that could happen that aren't necessarily what we expect?
Joe, nobody really talked about this when I was younger, so I appreciate your comment. The one thing that I heard about sometimes as a boy was that the testicles fail to descend. I think I might have had a cousin that fit that category, and they had to do some kind of minor corrective surgery.
Yeah, that's pretty common. I'm not sure how common, but it's pretty common. Anything else?
Well, back up to week 8, I think sometimes the feet, the male parts don't regress as much as is normal, I guess.
So you could end up with a female that has at least some undeveloped male parts or semi-developed male parts.
Yeah.
Yeah. What else?
This is Kristen Conwell. Sometimes way back at the beginning, you might have unexpected deletions in the Y or the extra X, so that all of the things that follow then, or actually having a whole extra X or an X, XXY or something. At least that's my very vague understanding, is that with these deletions or extra things, that the whole picture can become pretty muddied with all of those differentiation steps not happening as expected.
So I think what you're saying is you could end up with, instead of the expected XX or XY, you could end up with XXXX
Yes.
or XXXY,
Yeah.
or, you could almost, I wouldn't say the possibilities are endless, but there's a lot of possibilities for what you could end up with. And then that could derail the expected development. Good, thanks. What else? Can you think of something else?
Joe,
Yes.
this is Leroy Chubb. I went to the doctor some years ago thinking I had a mold on my chest. And the doctor examined it and finally called in another doctor and examined it. And they finally concluded it was a third nipple. So that just sort of like things happen like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I wonder if there's a person who could explain why that happens. I know I'm not a person who could explain that. Is it genetics? Is it hormones? What happened? Yeah. Anybody else?
Joe, this is Casey again. The progression that you outlined there, is there any deviation? Maybe you'll talk about this later, but does the XX suddenly at some point, because of the mother's health or external circumstances, switch to XY, or is once that's locked in, pretty much the road that's followed?
As far as I know, and if there's doctors, well, I know there are doctors here for this class, so you may want to correct me if I'm correct, but if I'm wrong, but as far as I know, an X can't change to a Y and vice versa. So if you actually have, what typically happens is you either get an X from your mom and a Y from your dad, and that's not going to change later on during development. It's right at the beginning. You could, as Kristen pointed out, you could end up with a strange combination that surprises us of chromosomes. You can end up with XXXX or XXY. There's all kinds of combinations you could end up with. And that's more related to your parents' sperm and egg that combine. Once you get it, I don't think it can develop into something else. Anyone else?
This is Ken. It's an ongoing developing process. It seems to me, I don't know scientifically, but it seems to me that a lot of outside factors can contribute to the further development. A traumatic shock or a disease that the mother contracts while the fetus is developing. So it seems like there can be a lot of different factors that play into what might potentially develop.
Yeah, I don't have a specific idea of an example of what you're talking about, but I think you're right, Ken. I think certainly we know that drugs, for instance, that the mother takes during pregnancy could affect development. And why couldn't some of those drugs affect sexual development? I'm sure they would, or environmental pollutants, that kind of thing. I don't have a specific example in mind, but I think you're right. Another thing that I've thought about a little bit is, I talked briefly about all of us have testosterone and estrogen. It's just a matter of how much of each we have. And, that's something that could potentially change or be different in a developing embryo. You could end up with a female that produces more testosterone than expected. And so you think of all the changes that could cause if there's what looks like a female baby with an XY, but for some reason she's producing more testosterone. And that could cause a whole cascade of events. So anybody else? One last chance, and then I'm going to.
Yeah. So Joe, this is
Yeah.
Barry Frisbee. I mean, there's been some research on also just the embryonic environment that the embryo grows in. Moms, women can produce estrogen in a lot of extreme amounts, or they could also women produce their own version of testosterone. So some of the research in intersexed babies, for instance, or trans kids, has been looking at whether or not some of that is due to excess of testosterone produced by the mother during pregnancy.
Interesting. Thank you, Barry. All right. So if there's anyone else dying to share, now would be the time.
Oh, dying would be bad.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. Thank you, everybody. All right, so I want to give you a few examples of how things could end up differently than expected, and the kinds of problems that causes in society, particularly problems around discrimination, as Barry kind of alluded to. So our speaker last week wasn't very fond of this genderbread person illustration, because if you look at the lines on the right, they're all linear. You know, either you're female or male, or you're something in between. And she wasn't very happy with that idea, because it's more complicated than that. And it's as I think she used the word kaleidoscope. And I do like that idea, that when we're talking about diversity of how people develop and how people think about their sexuality and express their sexuality, it is more like a kaleidoscope than it is like a line. But in terms of biological sex, I do, for me, thinking about it as a line does help a bit, because most of us, when we're born, we're identifiably female, or we're identifiably male. A doctor can look at us, can measure our hormones, and can say, okay, this is a boy, or you had a girl. And of course, you all know about, now we're doing reveal parties, gender reveal parties, which really should be called biological sex reveal parties. But they're happening before birth, and burning forests down and things like that. But that's another story, another class. But we have this spectrum in the middle, in between male and female, and it really is a spectrum. There's a wide variety of things, as you all pointed out during our discussion, that are all classified under the term intersex. And inter means between, and kind of gets at the idea of this line, or this spectrum. In between male and female is a wide variety of combinations of chromosomes, combinations of hormones, combinations of sexual organs, and anything you can imagine is almost possible. Is it possible for a baby to have a penis and a vagina? Yes, is the answer. Is it possible for a baby to have two X chromosomes and an X and a Y chromosome? Yes, is the answer. Is it possible for a baby to have equal amounts of testosterone and estrogen? Yes, is the answer. So lots of combinations of kind of these sexual things that we've talked about that are measurable from a medical standpoint are possible. Now, one of the problems is that our society is so linear. We tend to think in binary terms. Did you have a boy or did you have a girl? Well, the answer is usually we had a boy or we had a girl, but sometimes the answer is we're not sure what our baby is. And sometimes even if the parents think they had a girl, the real answer is something else, something intersex. So how common are intersex people? Well, this is one of the examples, when we did this presentation, we actually developed it from another presentation, which was given quite a few years ago, maybe 8 or 9 years ago now. And this presentation uses a lot of things that are, a lot of examples, a lot of speakers that are kind of focused on white people. And we realized that belatedly. And here's an example. When we talk about how common intersex people are, the example we use is they're about as common as redheads. Well, that works in a white population, but if you're in Africa, that maybe isn't a very good metaphor to use, or even in some places in the United States where the majority of people are BIPOC. So we want to apologize for some of the whiteness of our presentation. We're aware of it. And we just want to acknowledge that, and we want to do better in the future. But intersex people, if you could spread the redheads around the world equally distributed, then that's about where you'd find, that's about how many intersex people you would find around the world. So if you look at the very bottom bullet, 1 out of 2 babies out of 100 births are born with an geez, I'm not sure what that last word says. You guys, it's all covered up with your faces. I think it's supposed to say internal organs of male and female. Is that right, Barry? Yeah. So that's where we talk about intersex people being as common as redheads. Redheads are about 1 to 2% of the population worldwide, and intersex babies that have some combination of male and female on the inside are about the same, 1 to 2%. Now, where combinations where you have a baby with actual visible genitals, a male and female, that's much rarer, 1 out of 2,000. But 1 out of 2,000 isn't that rare. So intersex people are fairly common. So why don't we hear about it? Well, if you had a chance to watch Cecilia McDonald, I'm curious about, I'll ask you in a minute how many of you saw that video already. She basically said, because they're all underground, they're hiding, they're in the closet. Let me give you some examples of people who were born intersex, or this first example is not really a person who's born intersex. It's more of a medically created intersex. And this is a particularly tragic story and a Mennonite story. So David Reimer was born to a Mennonite family in 1965 in Canada. David Reimer was born as a twin. So David is on the right, his twin is on the left, and David was born with an XY chromosome. So far as we know, David was born a recognizable male, but he had the urethra in the middle of his penis, didn't come out of the end of the penis, it came out of the bottom of the penis. So something went wrong in the development of his penis, where he didn't have the hole in the normal place. And doctors were concerned about that. The doctor used a new technique, ended up burning his penis off, basically, caustically, and trying to correct it, destroyed it. So then another psychologist who at the time, this can get very complicated, I'll try to make it really simple. There was a psychologist who had a theory that he wanted to prove. And the theory was that you could turn anybody into a girl, any boy into a girl, or any girl into a boy, just by raising them as a boy or a girl. And so he convinced the parents to let him try. And so David and his twin went through a lot of psychological therapy with this doctor, and ended up scarring David for life. David was raised as a girl. I forget what her name was when she was being raised as a girl, but at some point, undergoing horrible gender dysphoria, David finally said, "I'm a boy." Ended up getting married, and then tragically ended up committing suicide as a young man. But this is an example of how our preconceptions of male and female can sometimes have tragic consequences in the lives of people. So Dutee Chand, you may have heard of her. As far as I know, she's a woman with an XX chromosome, but she had quite high testosterone levels and was actually barred from competing in Rio in the Olympics in 2013. So what determines your sex? Body hormones? Well, not in this case. We have a woman, but she's producing a lot of testosterone. Here, do your genitals determine your sex? Well, not really, because he didn't even have male genitals, but he was still a male. Ewa Klobukowska, Polish athlete, had one of those disorders that we talked about. She had an XX and an XXY. She had 5 sex chromosomes instead of 2. And so she ended up, while she was, for all appearances, a female, and eventually now she's a married woman with children, so obviously female. But at the time, the Olympic officials tested her and said, "Oh, you've got this disorder that gives you male characteristics. You can't compete with the females." It was horribly embarrassing to her. And they've actually since made all these tests confidential, and they have revamped what they actually consider as male, but ended up ruining her athletic career, or at least part of it, because of people's preconceptions about what's male and what's female. Here's Emma. This is a picture taken in 2016. She has incomplete male and female anatomy. So I think Linda may have talked about this. But even though she has male parts and female parts, they're both incomplete. Her parents have decided to raise her as a girl. And she says, "I'm comfortable with my differences." So a big change from David Reimer back in 1965. So the question here is, can we think about sex as a binary thing? Is it just you're going to have a female baby or boy baby, or is sex not really a binary concept? So I'm curious how many of you saw this, a video by Cecilia McDonald. So I think it's about time for me to stop my presentation. So I'm going to stop screen sharing. And Rod is going to have to leave soon anyway, so the recording is going to stop.